Welcome everyone to today's rulemaking workshop on use. My name is Austin Scharf, and I'm going to provide us a quick overview of the agenda and some logistics for the meeting, and then turn it over to Chair Danner for some opening remarks. Today's agenda will be a little bit different than the way we've run workshops in the past. We are going to have two presentations to kick off the first half of the workshop. The first one will be presented by the Joint Utilities, and the second one by NWEC and Climate Solutions. During these presentations, we're going to ask that you keep your comments either on like a separate Word document, or if you got pencil and paper, take notes there. Because the second half of the presentation will be open comments for stakeholders. During the first part, we are going to reserve time for the commissioners and the UTC and Commerce team to ask questions to the presenters. So we will have about a 10-minute break around 2:35, and then that second half will be dedicated towards stakeholder questions, concerns, alternative proposals, as well as next steps. And at that time, you can raise your hand using the raise your hand function, or put your comments in the chat box. Both options are located at the bottom of your screen. If you move your cursor down there, you should find the chat button as well as the reactions button. The chat function opens up the comment box, and the reactions button, you will find the raise hand function there. So with that, Commissioner Danner, please take it away.
Hey, thank you so much, Austin. Well, all I want to do is welcome everybody this afternoon. This has been a very complicated issue and a hot topic for us. And so I appreciate that everybody is sticking with us as we try and figure out what we intend to do on this. I'm excited to hear from the presentations from the groups of stakeholders, and I look forward to hearing your ideas and then having you help us identify, whatever commonalities there are and whatever possible decision points we can consider going forward. Again, I think this is, we've had a lot of conversation over the definition of a single word, but this is important, and I really look forward to everyone's input today. Just for the record, because this is a formal workshop of the UTC. This is docket UE 210183. And also for the record, today is August 12th, 2021. And so this is a workshop of the Department of Commerce and the Utilities and Transportation Commission. So with that, I'll turn it back to you, Austin.
Thank you so much, Chair Danner. Steve Johnson of the UTC is going to provide some opening remarks for the Joint Utilities presentation. For the Joint Utilities, please feel free to share your screen with your presentation, and we'll get started here in a sec. Steve?
Yeah, we'll have two presentations, as Austin just mentioned. The first one will be the Joint Utilities. I'm not exactly sure who's going to present, so if you want to bring up your slides and introduce yourselves, we'll go from there. I think Mary Winkle is going to do the presentation, and maybe have some other assistants.
Ian Hunter's also doing it. Yep. So it looks like Ian's got the slides up, and so I think we are ready to hear from you, Ian and Mary.
Well, great. Thank you very much. Just a quick tech test. Can everyone hear me?
Yeah.
Great. Thank you. Always the toughest part of these meetings is getting the tech squared away at the beginning. I'm Ian Hunter. I'm a policy analyst for the Snohomish County PUD, and I'll pause to give my co-presenter an opportunity to introduce herself.
Thanks, Ian. This is Mary Winky. I do policy work at PacifiCorp.
Thanks, Mary. I just want to confirm that everyone can see the maximized screen version and it's not a presentation mode.
We're seeing your next slide part as well.
I think we're seeing presentation mode.
Yeah.
All right, let's see if I can fix that. I spoke too soon.
Ian, I think if you click on that display settings up at the top, there's a little down arrow, you should be able to, yep, never mind.
How's that?
There we go. Thank you.
All right,
Oz.
we're in business. Well, I just want to express, appreciation for the opportunity to present today. This process has really been the culmination of a number of discussions that the utilities and other stakeholders have engaged in over the past few months. The objective of that was, of course, to try and find a compliance framework that really blends all stakeholder interests together to find one solution that we could bring forward. We weren't able to achieve that goal, but I will say that the joint utilities really feel that significant directional progress was made. We understood the other stakeholders' concerns on a deeper level, and we think that we've been able to integrate some of those concerns into the proposal that you're about to hear. We have presented this proposal to other stakeholders previously. We didn't quite get full agreement, but this is reflective of where the joint utilities really feel that we strike the right balance between the interests of all parties. So as we approach this question, what did we really hope to achieve with a compromise proposal? What were kind of the overarching goals and philosophies that we wanted to make sure got included into a compromise proposal? So what we think that our proposal does achieve, first and foremost, we achieve the goals and the intent of CETA by transitioning the state's electricity supply to 100% carbon neutral by 2030, and then 100% carbon free by 2045. That's, that feels like a baseline goal to have, and we feel that our proposal really does that. We want to drive transformational change in the utility industry. Transformation is in the name of the act, and so we really want to see actions being taken by the utility community and the energy industry as a whole to kind of drive that change towards a clean future. We're interested in maintaining affordability for our customers. At the end of the day, our customers are who we're doing this all for, and we want to make sure that the actions that we take are affordable for our customers and don't put an undue cost burden on them, and that they're also able to derive all of the benefits of the investments that we're making on their behalf. We do want to recognize that there's a nexus between energy production and energy use for retail load service. This relationship, utilities are balancing loads and resources on, a temporal basis down to the second. Electricity is that fun only commodity in the world that is consumed the second that it's produced. So we want to recognize that there is a nexus between production and retail load service through some aspects of our proposal. As I mentioned, we utilities are managing portfolios and loads on a frequent basis, on an operational basis. And so we do need some flexibility to be able to manage that. But we also want to make sure that we're meeting our customer needs and we're meeting CETA compliance, kind of finding the sweet spot between all three of those goals. And then finally, we want our proposal to make sure that we can participate and realize the benefits, both on an environmental and a cost attribute perspective of participating in bilateral and organized wholesale energy markets. And so we think that we put together a proposal that achieves all of these goals, and we'll jump in and talk about how we do that. So I'll turn it over at this point to Mary to walk us through some of the core elements of the proposal.
Thanks, Ian. And I would be remiss also if I didn't mention before I launch into the elements of our proposal. Ian mentioned working over the last few months with stakeholders, trying to get to a compromise. But I also just would remiss if I didn't mention that really these conversations have been going on for a couple of years. We've done a lot of work through the markets work group, which many people on this call today participated in, and I think we have our thinking on this has evolved over the course of those discussions. I think we've really taken in a lot of what stakeholders have said, and a lot of public conversations, also bilateral conversations with folks. So I really want to emphasize that I think this proposal does really represent kind of an evolution in thinking throughout kind of a fairly long time in kind of thinking through some of these real complex issues. So I'm just going to kind of walk through the elements of our proposal. Some of them are familiar and some of them are new. So I'll try to kind of call out what I'm going to emphasize is new. The core compliance methodology, I think, is the same as what we've talked about before, what we've considered, what is clear in the statute. It's retail eligible generation is equal to retail load over a 4-year compliance period, and eligible energy must be acquired together with its environmental attributes. There's also the incorporation of a nexus between, in 2 ways. There's an incorporation of a nexus between energy production and energy use. The first is a deliverability requirement. Effectively, the resource, the energy produced, has to be able to deliver to Washington load. And the way that we do this is by specifying eligible points of delivery, effectively, where that energy can be delivered to the grid. Strong double counting protections in place. I think that's something that we definitely have talked a lot about and wanted to mention here. This includes specified source sales being included for the energy, or the RECs, excuse me, any RECs associated with specified source sales would be excluded from compliance with both the 80% primary, what we're referring to as primary compliance, as well as the 20% alternative compliance. We have provided an appendix to this presentation that goes into a little bit more detail on the double counting, kind of the mechanics of how we would achieve that. But that exclusion would remain in place. The new element that we have added is to establish a limit on what constitutes eligible generation. So this concept is to create more of a tie between, again, energy production and energy used to serve retail load. So the concept is there would be an annual cap on eligible generation, and that annual cap would be equal to the utilities retail load. So that, and this is a partly to incorporate some elements of the financial accounting proposal that were made last fall, and kind of representing what we think is a compromise approach. This is something that it would be unique to kind of your typical, say, RPS program. This is something that is limiting what generation is available based on what generation may have been consumed over the time period. So we'll go into a little bit more detail on the next slide on all of these elements. So as I mentioned, this proposal has really evolved over time. There's some core pieces of it, I think, that have been in place the entire time, including the core compliance methodology, which is still eligible generation based on, you know, the generation articulated in the statute, non-emitting, renewable, et cetera, and that the energy must be acquired with the environmental attribute. Again, including that deliverability component, that the eligible generation must be provided at one of several specified points of delivery, basically saying that there is a physical nexus between the resource and load, and that resource is capable of delivering to Washington load. And again, going through again, talking about double counting of environmental attributes, ensuring that that doesn't happen. Not only it will not happen by using Regis in terms of making sure that, you know, each REC that's being used for compliance is not being used for another purpose, but also looking at utility transactions and specified sales made where, for instance, to California, where a REC retirement is not required, but that REC would not be eligible for use for CETA compliance. And then again, really, I think, you know, primarily what, in this new element is really, I think, trying to get at this sort of concept of a proposal that is more than an RPS. And how this would work is it's not an annual compliance period, but you have an annual limit on the quantity of eligible generation. So and Ian later on is going to walk through some examples so that folks can kind of really understand the mechanics of how this would work. But to the extent a utility generates more energy over the course of the year than its retail load, the excess generation would not be available for that primary compliance. So it wouldn't be available for that 80%. Those RECs associated with that generation would still be available for the alternative compliance, but would not be available for for the 80%. Again, the concept being that you're creating that or emphasizing that connection between generation and load. Again, I was already launching into this, and we've dubbed it annual surplus accounting. I think the concept being that, you know, your energy surplus over the course of the years is effectively considered to have been sold rather than having been used to serve load, and therefore it's ineligible for that primary compliance. But as I mentioned, RECs associated with that surplus could still be used for alternative compliance. But then the actual compliance report and the compliance period would continue to be that 4-year compliance period. Reporting would be done on a 4-year basis, consistent with the statute. And compliance would be based on the total quantity of eligible generation across those 4 years, with an annual cap on the quantity of eligible generation. So this is still my slide, right, Ian?
Yes, you got one more.
Sorry. I lost my count on the slides. Thanks. So one more. So kind of what is the evolution of this, or why are we proposing this? I think, you know, we've heard positions from other stakeholders that the use requirement needed to have some kind of final ownership, or utility claiming final ownership of the electricity. I think the utilities really found that the mechanics of that to be very difficult, because it effectively would require sort of a very comprehensive review of all the utilities transactions to then, you know, sort of verify that certain sales didn't happen, sort of proving a negative that energy wasn't sold. And I think we really struggled sort of figuring out how that would work in practice. But conceptually, I think we did understand it, that there should be some concept or connection between energy and its use for load service. So I think this annual surplus accounting is attempting to get at that in a way that I think is much simpler than trying to review utility transactions or try to kind of trace where energy is being bought and sold across a very complex market. And dovetailing on what I was just saying, I think we definitely continue to believe that tracking across more granular time frames, or attempting to track along bilateral source-to-sink transaction basis creates very significant technical difficulties, will unnecessarily drive up costs, and in particular on sort of the bilateral source-to-sink energy transactions, you know, effectively precluding participation in current regional markets where you don't have bilateral sales occurring. And so we continue to think that there's much simpler ways to achieve some of these concepts, short of developing that kind of complex review of utility transactions, or attempting to really identify sort of the energy flow or transaction flow, if you will, versus creating accounting mechanisms between energy produced over a time period and load over a time period. So the utilities really believe that this proposal strikes a balance. There is the utilities continue to need tools to manage increasing load and generation variability. Load and generation are only likely to get more variable, not less. And utilities need to be able to be flexible in terms of how they manage that variability. So that annual time period really preserves that ability to continue to be flexible. And we think that's consistent with the statute as well, which is designed to accommodate that seasonal generation variability. At the same time, however, it does do something that is more than just a procurement standard, that is more than just an RPS. It creates that nexus between energy production and retail load, which a brief informal survey of state policies concluded that no other state has incorporated some level of surplus accounting or cap on eligible generation. So this would be something that would be unique to Washington. Perhaps, and I will just caveat that by saying my informal review was not comprehensive. So if somebody wants to correct me later, that's perfectly fine. But nonetheless, I will say confidently that it is not a standard element of RPS programs across the West. So I will stop there, and I believe I am turning it back over to Ian at this point. So I will let you take it back over, Ian. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Mary. So after kind of talking through, the core components of the proposal, how we think this would work, and then a little bit of why we talked about it, I'm hoping to cover a little bit of, if this policy was adopted, what would the actual implications be for utilities and for the energy industry? So I'll just kind of walk through those one by one. The first is that it would really limit a utility's ability to apply those annual surpluses that we see on an average annual basis to our primary compliance obligation. We wouldn't be able to use surplus generation from a really high generation year to augment a shortfall of eligible generation in another year from a primary compliance standpoint. It does, however, let utilities have the flexibility. It provides those flexible tools for variable generation to smooth out those shortfalls that may occur on a less granular basis than a year. So it gives utilities a little bit more risk on an inter-year basis, but it does provide that flexibility that utilities need to manage their portfolio on a less granular basis. It's really going to drive change in utility portfolio planning. When a utility starts its portfolio planning process and looks at all the different obligations that it has to meet, compliance with state regulations is, of course, a big aspect of that. If you can take your surpluses and balance them out over the 4-year period, that'll have a different effect on your resource choices than if you have to be considering your surpluses don't count intra-year. So it's really going to shift that utility planning towards portfolios that are going to meet their compliance needs on an annual basis. Now, that's not to say that that's going to be the only aspect that's going to drive utility portfolio planning, but it's going to be, a big piece from the compliance perspective. And next one's a big one. It really promotes continued participation in bilateral and organized markets in the West. The annual look really lifts that compliance examination out of the operational time horizon and allows utilities to transact in markets and get that value that you see in an organized market. Without that, if you're looking on a very granular basis at transactions, market transactions would not necessarily be eligible for CETA compliance if you were to go down to that narrow time frame, which would eliminate a lot of the value that the market provides to utilities in their participation for the effective and efficient dispatch of clean resources. It does, however, provide room for utilities to influence market development going forward. So I think we could make the blanket statement that today's market may operate in a field where there's a number of different state policies, but this would allow utilities to continue that discussion and talk about how we're going to be tackling this going forward. Which kind of brings us to one other aspect of our proposal that we haven't mentioned so far. As part of the compromise solution, what utilities would be willing to commit to is those further regional discussions to talk about how markets are going to evolve in the light of state clean energy policies. Right now, there's different state energy clean policies across the West, which definitely has an effect on how markets may evolve in the future. We want to make sure we have a vested interest in making sure that markets continue to evolve to accommodate these state policies and to hopefully harmonize a little bit to allow utilities to both participate in markets and meet their state clean energy policies, deriving the value therein. We want to make sure that, as the markets evolve, that we have a voice in those conversations and that we're driving the markets towards kind of our clean energy future that we're really envisioning for Washington State. A couple more implications of the proposal. We really feel that our compromise maintains the environmental attribute of eligible resources for our customers. When we establish the surplus accounting at the annual level, we have that within year flexibility that I talked about before, not only for hydro resources, which is explicitly called out in the statute, but also for other variable resources, because as we think about a clean portfolio, hydro isn't the only clean resource that we're going to be using. We're going to need kind of an all of the above approach, including wind, solar, demand response, energy storage, and other types of resources. And by having the compliance set at an annual level, it provides us flexibility to use those resources and get the value out of them. It limits that risk of losing the environmental or compliance benefit in the instance where customers have invested in a clean resource, the clean resource generates and provides its value into the marketplace or into the grid, but then they would not be able to claim that attribute for compliance in Washington State. Last, but definitely not least, it really supports system reliability and adequacy. We're going into a period where there's a lot of focus on adequacy especially, but also reliability on the electric system. I think utilities really want to pride themselves on how reliable they are, and that's all happening on an operational basis. And so by keeping that surplus accounting on an annual basis, it allows utilities some flexibility as they think about reliability and adequacy to craft programs that make sense for those programs while also meeting state requirements. So we've talked a lot in words about how this proposal is going to work, but we wanted to walk through just a few.
Ian?
Yes.
Ian, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but Austin just put a note here that we have 4 minutes. So I'm wondering, Austin, either if there's any possibility of us having more time, or if we should kind of skip to the end.
Let's turn that over to the rulemaking teams and commissioners. Would you like to see the examples, or?
Yeah, I actually would like to keep going. I think this is important. I don't, if we find ourselves getting way behind schedule, then we'll change course. But can we keep going for now?
Perfect.
I agree.
Right.
I think it would be helpful.
Yes, I as well.
And then we'll plan on adjusting the amount of time available for the second presentation as well. And
yeah, we'll shorten it a lot. Yeah. No.
Not what I had in mind.
No.
All right.
All right, well, being mindful of time, I will try and move through the examples in a sprightly fashion. We want to give some visual examples of how this works. So what we're looking at here is kind of a 4-year representation, each year kind of divvied out so you can see the effects. Year 1, you've got 120 megawatts worth of overall CETA compliant generation, but the utility only has a retail load in that year of 100 megawatts. So the green section of the bar would be what the utility could claim for CETA quote unquote primary compliance. And the blue would be surplus CETA compliant generation in that year. Then year 2, you have a little less surplus, but you still have some. Year 3, you fall under your 100 megawatt load. And then year 4, you're even farther below. And I'll just make the little point that this utility has 100 megawatts of load flat every year. If somebody could tell me their secret, that'd be great. But these are just simplified examples to kind of demonstrate how the program works or how the compliance mechanism would work. So that's each year individually. But because this is a 4-year compliance period, we want to look at what the compliance filing would kind of look like. So the utility would have 400 megawatts worth of load over that 4-year period in total. And then they would look at their resources. So the green section of this bar is kind of the summation of everything that was under their load in the last over the 4-year period. And then the blue bar would be surplus eligible renewables that are used for alternative compliance. So remember, we can't claim anything that's surplus for primary compliance, but provided that we keep the RECs, we could still use those RECs for alternative compliance. So again, that green bar represents the sum, which is about 370 megawatt hours. And then the blue section of the bar represents RECs from surplus renewables that are being used for alternative compliance. Because again, you can't claim that 30 megawatts of surplus from the first 2 years as primary compliance. And so in this case, the utility has 400 megawatts of load. They have 400 megawatts of combined primary and alternative compliance. So they would be compliant with CETA. Example 2. Years look a little bit different. You've got a shortfall in year 1, another shortfall in year 2, more surplus in year 3, and then year 4, you're short again. So you've got kind of 3 years where you're short, but only 1 year where you're surplus. So how would this actually look for the utility on a compliance basis? Once again, 400 megawatts of load. When you sum up all of your eligible generation under that load curve, you only come up with about 330 megawatts or 320 megawatts worth of resource. You've got that little bit of surplus that you can claim for alternative compliance in year 3, but then you would have a gap of about 55 megawatt hours that doesn't come from your generation portfolio. It's not part of your surplus, and you would have to make that up with some additional alternative compliance. So you would have to go out into the marketplace and either acquire unbundled renewable energy credits, or an energy transformation project, or you could pay the alternative compliance cost. So example 3, and again, this is a simplified example for our evaluation benefit. Utility has a really great year 1, lots of surplus, but year 2, it absolutely tanks. So you're kind of seeing the ups and downs that a utility might see in their portfolio, kind of taken to the extreme. So again, year 1 and year 3, big surplus, year 2 and year 4, big shortfalls. So how does this actually look for compliance for that utility in aggregate? Again, 400 megawatts of load. You've got 300 megawatts worth of CETA compliant generation. And if you remember, the surplus kind of matched the shortfalls, but you can't claim all of that primary or secondary alternative compliance for your CETA compliance, because if you remember, you may have 100 megawatts worth of total surplus over that 4-year period, but you can only use 20% of your total retail load for alternative compliance, or up to 20%. So if the utility's total retail load is 400 megawatts, 20% of that is 80 megawatt hours, which means that you would only be able to claim 80 megawatt hours out of that total 100 of surplus towards your alternative compliance. And what would actually be happening to this utility in this instance is they would not be in compliance with CETA after the 4-year period, because they did not have enough primary compliance CETA generation, and they've capped out their alternative compliance obligation. So just a few examples, and we'd be happy to talk through some examples a little bit later on. I will make a note that the numerical portions of those examples can be found in the appendix to our presentation, so you can kind of see how the numbers work out in kind of an alternative way to look at those scenarios. And so I will, at this point, turn it back over to Mary to kind of close us out.
Thanks, Ian. I'll try to go through this very quickly. Just a couple of items to mention. So the utility proposal would use total retail load as the compliance requirement. The line and energy storage losses would not be included in the calculation of compliance. We think this is consistent with the statute, and also how RECs are created. And then also, we do also think that this proposal will harmonize with other compliance requirements and other policies in the state. And we don't want to see, kind of the proposal conflicting with other state compliance requirements. So in particular, other policies have annual reporting periods or annual looks. And so we think that this proposal will be consistent with that. And just very quickly, again, just kind of reiterating the benefits of our proposal. Broadly speaking, I think we think it incorporates elements that are consistent with both the intent and the language of CETA, and will allow utilities the necessary tools to continue to maintain affordability and reliability for their customers while also achieving that transformational change. So I will leave it there in the interest of time.
Thanks, Mary.
And then I don't know. Oh, I'll turn it back over to you, Austin.
No, that is great. Let us move to the next presentation, and we'll come back to questions from the commissioners at the end. That sounds all right, Glenn and Steve.
Yeah, that sounds good.
All right, Glenn, you are in charge of giving our introductions for the next group. So I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, the next proposal that we received and scheduled for presentation at this workshop is from the Northwest Energy Coalition and Climate Solutions. Kelly Hall and Lauren McCloy are going to be presenting that. So I will turn it over to the two of you.
All right, thank you, Glenn. Work on sharing my screen here. All right, can everybody see this?
Yeah.
Excellent, great. And I heard we're getting extra time, so thank you for that.
Yeah.
Appreciate it. So hi everyone, Lauren McCloy. I'm the Policy Director for Northwest Energy Coalition. Appreciate the opportunity to present today on a proposal that we've been working on over the last several months and extending into last year as well, and have tried to be responsive to some of the things that we've heard from the utility group as we've been working together. I want to echo that we've had a lot of really good faith discussions on this. We've all worked to evolve our thinking, and while we weren't able to come to a consensus, I think that we too see some potential points of compromise here. You know, and we also recognize the need to strike the right balance and share many of the same goals that the utilities talked about in their presentation. You know, the first being that, you know, achieving the standards set by CETA. Just want to clarify that the 2030 standard is that, you know, 80% renewable and non-emitting with the 20% alternative compliance. I think everybody knows that, but just making sure that that's stated up front. You know, we want to see that transformational change that was envisioned in the bill. We definitely want to maintain affordability for customers, and I think that our proposal provides some flexibility in order to do that. And, you know, the utilities talk about recognizing the nexus between production and use. And really, I think that this is the core of the disagreement. I think that we would say that the implementation of the policy needs to recognize the difference between production and acquisition and use. And so I think that that will, you know, that remains kind of still the core issue that we need the agencies, you know, to help us sort through. So by way of background, you know, I did want to just remind folks about the first round of CETA rulemakings, which I think provides some important context for this conversation and are still relevant. Our comments here today are supported by the legal memorandum we filed in docket UE 19-191023, a year and a day from today. 2 points we'll keep coming back to are, one, that both RCW 19-405-0401A and RCW 19-405-050 are identical in their reference to use. Both say a utility must demonstrate its compliance with the standard using a combination of non-emitting electric generation and electricity from renewable resources. And for the 2030 standard, it says, or alternative compliance options. And then two, that the statute refers to using electricity rather than resources, which indicates, it's a consumption-based clean electricity standard and not a procurement-based renewable portfolio standard. So in thinking about a framework for accounting rules for utilities to demonstrate compliance with CETA, we start with some core principles. Number one being that the first compliance period begins in 2030. That's 8 years from now. And what this means is that in the near term, we think it makes sense to focus primarily on planning and reporting, and agencies won't really need to make a determination of utility compliance until the end of the first compliance period in 2034. Secondly, there is significant flexibility in the compliance options available to utilities between 2030 and 2045 when the 100% clean standard goes into effect. And we can be certain, I think everybody has broad agreement about this, that markets will continue to evolve during that time. So in the short term, we think that a financial accounting framework like what we've proposed is sufficient for utilities to plan for and report on their progress towards meeting the CETA standards, as long as direct accounting for use remains the ultimate objective. And in the interest of tailoring regulation to evolving markets, which is something that I know the agencies are both very committed to, we think that Washington agencies should also commit to longer term efforts to evaluate market mechanisms that will support utilities serving customers with 100% clean energy as markets and tracking tools evolve. We recommend that the rulemaking commit the state to implementing a strategy for utilities to characterize and track electricity transactions for the purpose of demonstrating compliance with clean energy standards and carbon policies. I think we detected some openness to those longer term conversations from the utilities, so I just want to point that out. And ensuring that CETA is implemented in a way that will allow for integration between state clean energy standards and carbon policies in the West. So just want to reiterate that area of agreement. In addition to those principles, our framework is built on these assumptions. First of all, not only is it not currently possible to track electrons from generation to a specific retail load, but we don't think it's necessary under CETA to do that anyway. Number two, when power is exchanged in the market, we understand that the exchange is contractual. The electrons will go where they go as governed by the laws of physics. I don't think any of us are physicists, so that's not what we're talking about here. Number three, if the electricity has been sold, whether it's owned by the utility or purchased and then resold, by definition, it simply can't be considered used to serve load. So understanding what is sold in addition to what's being purchased is really, I think, pretty essential to determining what resources are needed for compliance and ultimately what was used. And then fourthly, some form of documentation is needed. We understand that. We think that the forms of documentation that already exist and are being utilized in the markets we have now could be sufficient under this framework. That being said, we're not experts in the types of documentation that are generated by utility market transactions. The utilities have much more information than we have access to. So we're open to ideas about what documentation might be needed to demonstrate compliance at the end of the first compliance period. And just want to note again that that will be in 2034. Much more granular tracking tools are currently being explored. For example, we're aware of some efforts by corporate buyers like Google and Emirates, and we encourage the agencies to continue to learn more about those efforts as the market continues to evolve. But in the spirit of trying to bring solutions to the table, we have spent some time over the last several months examining existing and emerging documentation options, including NERC e-tags, which I'm going to talk just very briefly about today. We believe that e-tags are a viable near-term solution. E-tags are a necessary tool for transacting electricity across balancing areas in every state in the WEC, regardless of state policy. And they're used primarily for transmission scheduling and accompany every transaction that crosses between BAs. So we see them as a convenient tool for documenting the sale and purchase of electricity from source to sink and can also be used to provide the purchaser and seller, as well as the auditor or eventual market monitor, information about the transaction, such as the resource type, its emissions, or its eligibility for various state clean energy programs. The simplest way to accomplish this would be to use what's called the miscellaneous information field in the tag to describe the electricity. And ideally, I think all participants would use an agreed upon set of labels for this purpose. The information can be entered manually right now today, and but you can also, a drop-down menu could also be created. This would take a little bit more work with the WEC technical committees who oversee this type of stuff, but it would likely take a little bit more time. But the manual entry is an option that's available to us today. For electricity that does not have an E-tag, we think that meter data can be used, and meter data is currently used for energy generated and used within the BA, and to adjust dynamic transfer tags and pseudo tie transfer tags after the fact. So this is a common practice in current markets. And we feel pretty confident that this combination of documentation between meter data and E-tags is not only much more granular than any alternative that we would come up with, but it's also reasonably available in the near term. I heard utilities say earlier that using these will drive up costs and limit participation in existing markets, but I just want to challenge that, as we have challenged that in the conversations, saying that we haven't really seen any evidence to support those statements. So interested in having more continued conversations about this option. And then finally, just want to clarify that the proposal that we're talking about today allows for E-tags or other documentation. So it's not that you have to use all E-tags. I think we're trying to put some flexibility here and say that we think E-tags will work. And if there's other documentation that's available, we're open to that as well. So this is what an E-tag looks like. This is a very simple illustrative example only, and I would encourage the agencies, to request some real world examples from the utilities themselves. As you can see, this tag is showing a transaction that happened on June 30th in the 10 o'clock to 11 o'clock hour central time between utility 1 and utility 2. And I just want to clarify that PSE in this context is not Puget Sound Energy, but it stands for Purchasing Serving Entity. And for the purpose of this example, we can just say that the PSE is a utility or a transmission owner. So here on top, the tag is showing a market path where the tag is created and transferred from utility 1 to BPA's transmission system to utility 2. This tag also includes miscellaneous information identifying utility 1 as bearing the reserve requirement for this specified sale. So you see that here to the right of the market path description. Below that, you can see the physical path where the tag is tracked from the source, utility 1, to BPA's transmission system, to utility 2's transmission system, and then finally to its sink in utility 2. And these columns here that are blacked out actually identify the resource. I've redacted this for the purpose of the presentation, but we know that this was hydropower generation from a dam, and the tag actually shows the name of the generator here. So in this example, what we're suggesting is that the tag could use the miscellaneous field, which is over in this 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9th column in the physical path, to characterize this electricity as renewable under CETA or other programs, or carbon-free under the Climate Commitment Act or other carbon-based programs. And the box below that shows an alternative example representing the physical path for EIN transactions. Again, this is just a very simple example, essentially identical to the example above, except that it includes the token information required by the California ISO in the miscellaneous field. But our understanding is that you can add as much information to this field as you want. So this is one option for documentation, and one which we encourage the agencies to explore further with the utilities and with technical experts. And with that, I will pass it over to Kelly to talk about the accounting proposal.
Great, thanks, Lauren. And if you can just keep moving the slide,
Yep.
that would be great. Hi, everyone. I'm Kelly Hall from Climate Solutions, and just want to start by reiterating what Ian, Mary, and Lauren have said. You know, it's been you know, we put a lot of work in with other stakeholders, and it's been really good to have conversations over the past few months. We clearly haven't reached consensus, but I do think we've both come closer towards one another, and if nothing else, better understand each other's concerns, which helps us to think more outside of the box to solutions. So just want to acknowledge that that those conversations have been helpful. You know, what Lauren was just describing is our long-term vision, where we ultimately see or hope tracking and documenting CETA can go with e-tags, or, you know, I'm sure folks have seen that Google is doing some really interesting work around hourly recs. We do think that over the next 20-25 years, markets will evolve, but also acknowledge that in the short term within our current systems that you know, we need a short-term solution potentially. And so, you know, as Lauren opened up, I think there's still just a fundamental disagreement on, you know, whether this is a procurement standard or consumption standard. And the way we see it, you know, the law was not intended to continue to allow fossil fuel use. There's a penalty associated with that, and it's our view that under the utility proposal, utilities would be allowed to purchase renewable electricity and potentially be incentivized to purchase the lowest cost renewable electricity, sell it, and then use fossil fuels when they don't have enough renewable energy supply. And, you know, our goal and the intent with CETA is to really transform the entire system. It wasn't necessarily to avoid emissions in California or other states, but it was really focused on Washington customers and what Washington customers are using. And so with that, the fundamental disagreement becomes over what do you do with sold electricity? So when a utility has surplus electricity and sells it, what happens to that electricity? How is it accounted for? Again, under our interpretation, under the definition of an unbundled REC, if the REC is delivered to customers separately than the electricity, we do view that as an unbundled REC according to the definition. And so if the utility sells electricity and that attribute is maintained, we see that as an unbundled REC that would be available for compliance with the 20% standard, but not with the 80% standard. And so the question is, how do we account for that energy that's sold? I do want to acknowledge before getting into this that there could be other ways to do it. This is just one idea we have had, but certainly could be other ways of accounting for that energy that is sold. So first, what we would see is we would we look at the total utility system mix. So characterize all of a utility's purchases, generation, other procurements by resource type. You would have some sort of percentage of renewable, non-emitting versus emitting. Then you would move on and you would subtract out all of those specified sales from your total system mix, and you basically have this residual mix of what energy is left. And you would take that and you would impute that then onto your unspecified sales. When a utility is making sales into the market, while they would be unspecified and attributes wouldn't necessarily have to follow along with those unspecified sales, there would be a characteristic attributed to those sales that would basically prohibit a utility from using those attributed RECs or those attributed megawatt hours attributes for compliance with the 80% standard. So just want to put this up here on the steps, and I think it'll be much more clear when we go through some examples. But basically, I think the main difference here from the utility proposal is that you would actually have an imputation and an actual characteristic attached to those unspecified sales rather than just having them purely unspecified. So Lauren, if you could go to the next, I'm going to go through there's 6 scenarios, and the first few are pretty simple. I do want to mention that this was based on conversations that we've had with utilities. These have been shared with utilities, and were actually based on some initial scenarios that utilities sent us. So just want to kind of explain where this came from. I should have made a cool bar chart like Ian did, but I will do that for next time. So if we start with a utility that has 200 megawatt hours of load, they have, I'm just going to refer to it as clean generation, 160 megawatt hours. We can talk about line losses, I think, at a later date, but we do believe line losses need to be incorporated since this is a consumption basis instead of a procurement basis. What is 200 megawatt hours? Clean energy generation is 160. This utility has no emitting generation. They have unspecified purchases of 40 megawatt hours, leaving their compliance, their clean energy compliance is 160 megawatt hours, and they need 40 megawatt hours of alternative compliance mechanisms. I think that one's pretty straightforward, but that'll just kind of set the basis then for the following scenarios. So in scenario 2, we have that same 200 megawatt hour load. We have clean generation slightly higher than their load, but now we have unspecified purchases. So total energy that the utility has either generated or purchased is 250 megawatt hours. They then specify their renewable sales, sell 50 megawatt hours. The result is they maintain 180 megawatt hours of clean energy generation to use for compliance, and have an additional 20 megawatt hours of alternative compliance in order to hit the 100%. Okay, Lauren, you can go on. So those first two were fairly straightforward in that there were no unspecified sales. And here's where our proposal starts to have the imputed characteristic. So now we have a same load of 200 megawatt hours. We have clean energy generation also of 200 megawatt hours. We have an additional 50 megawatt hours of emitting generation, and then we have unspecified sales. So here's where we would impute a characteristic to those sales. Now, I haven't mentioned a time frame. We think this could work on a variety of time frames, so I'm going to leave that. I'm going to stay silent on that for now and just work with the framework. But basically, I believe, and I think Ian and Mary could speak to this, but just trying to highlight some of the differences. Under the utility proposal, the utility would be in compliance with CETA. Under our proposal, what we would require is that those 50 megawatt hours that are being sold, you would look at that time, what is the utility's residual mix? And for ease of numbers, if there was residual mix, basically if the utility is generating 80% clean energy, 20% emitting resources in that given time period, and they're selling 50 megawatt hours, then basically we would assume that the utility is selling 40 megawatt hours from renewable energy, although it would still be unspecified, but for compliance purposes, the utility would not be able to rely on those 40 megawatt hours for CETA's 80% compliance. So basically, you would take then the 200 clean energy generation that they have generated, you would subtract out 40 megawatt hours based on that imputation of the sale, and the utility would be left then with 40 megawatt hours in the alternative compliance mechanisms in order to achieve that 100% requirement. And Lauren, feel free to add anything if anything is unclear. I'm going to go into another scenario that is similar, but just slightly different. Instead of emitting generation here, we have unspecified purchases, but we have the same load, the same clean energy generation. Now we have unspecified purchases and unspecified sales. Again, even though they're both unspecified, when a utility is making a sale, we would impute a characteristic to that, and a certain percentage of those megawatt hours would not be able to be used for the CETA 80% compliance. I will note that those 40 megawatt hours, those RECs associated with those megawatt hours could still be used for the 20% compliance. So they could be used as an alternative compliance mechanism, but just wouldn't be able to be used for the
Can you hear me still, Kelly?
Yep.
Okay, so on this one, I did just want to add, what we're talking about in terms of imputing a character onto the sales is really just for accounting purposes, because those will not be used to fulfill a compliance obligation. We don't believe it creates a double counting issue. So I just want to clarify that piece.
Yep, the RECs would not necessarily be, that would be for a specified sale. The RECs could go along with the energy, but it would still technically be an unspecified sale. This would purely be for documentation purposes. And
yep.
CETA. Lauren, go back one scenario. I think skipped
okay.
5.
There we go.
Yep. Okay. So same load of 200 megawatt hours. We have 230 megawatt hours of clean generation. And now we have unspecified sales of 30 megawatt hours. So again, in this situation, a utility is, 100% clean. When they're selling those 30 megawatt hours, we would consider those all clean energy megawatt hours. And so that full 100% would be imputed on those. Again, a utility could save those for alternative compliance in a subsequent year, but they've already achieved 100%, so wouldn't need to use them for compliance. All right, last scenario.
Oh, sorry.
No problem. All right, last one. Same 200 megawatt hours of load. 230 megawatt hours of clean generation. We have another 20 megawatt hours of emitting generation. In this situation, we have 50 megawatt hours of unspecified sales. I tried to be consistent with the calculation, but in this situation, if utility is generating 90% renewable and 10% emitting in that given time period and selling 50 megawatt hours, the utility would basically attribute 50 megawatt hours from renewables, and so wouldn't be able to use those 45 megawatt hours for the 80% compliance. So in this situation, they would end up with 185 megawatt hours of clean energy for compliance, and they would need to use 15 megawatt hours of alternative compliance mechanisms. And I just already see Sean's question, but again, time period, I think we're just talking about the general framework for right now. I think the time period, it could work on a number of different time periods. Our perspective is that the tighter the time period, the more granular the time period, the more accurate, and the more it falls within the definition of actually serving your customers with clean energy. But we're not necessarily talking about a time period right now.
And that concludes our presentation. So I can stop sharing unless anybody wants me to go back.
Yeah, and I can just end by saying, we see this, like Lauren opened up, as a compromise. We see this is certainly has evolved from where we were in the opening. It's not how we see compliance being long-term. We would prefer something more granular along the lines of e-tags or, again, MRETs, something that is going to track that more granular transactions in a market. But we do think this still allows full participation in markets. I want to reiterate that there is a significant amount of flexibility with the 2030 compliance standard. And we do think that by 2045, markets will evolve, and that we need to give markets a reason to evolve as well. So we want to have markets be more transparent. Then we certainly need policies in place to help make that happen.
All right, well, thank you for that presentation. These slides are available, both presentations, on both the UTC website and on Commerce's. It's commerce.wa.gov/CETA. And then you can find the workshop material there pretty easily. Do we have any questions from the commissioners about either of the presentations?
So this is Commissioner Rendell. I don't know if you can see me. There you go. Thank you, both groups, for sharing your thoughts on this. I guess I had the same question that Sean did in the chat. The utilities presentation is focused on an annual sort of reporting basis with the compliance, as the statute indicates, for a 4-year period. So how have you thought about that compliance period? And I know, Kelly, you said the more granular, the better, but if the statute specifies over a 4-year period, how does your plan mesh with the statutory guidance on that?
Yeah, so we still see compliance happening over a 4-year time period, just to be clear. I think that the difference here again is what happens when a utility sells energy and basically separates their energy from the REC. How is that REC treated? So, you know, if a utility, for example, generates 100% clean energy one year and 60% clean energy the next year, and there aren't sales where they're selling clean energy, that then over a 4-year period, that would net out to 80%. So compliance is still on a 4-year basis. This is really a question of which, what megawatt hours and which energy can you actually count towards compliance. And in our view, if you're selling that energy should not be used for the 80% standard.
So I guess, are you expecting the companies to track this? So you're expecting the utilities to track this on a per transaction basis, totaling it up within a yearly scenario to calculate it with the 4-year standard. I guess that's what I'm trying to figure out. This is a per transaction basis that you're wanting the utilities to track.
Yes, we're
Or is the interim different than the ETAG documentation, or is that part of that interim proposal? I'm just trying to figure out what it is you're proposing.
I might jump in here and just say the methodology is the proposal. We did not necessarily land on a time period for this. I mean, I think I agree with Kelly that it can be pretty much applied to any time period. We think shorter is better. You know, obviously, we think hourly is doable under the ETAG framework, considering that's the granularity at which those transactions are documented, but that is not what we've proposed. We've proposed a methodology to use and then a documentation, you know, a thing that you can use to document it later. So I just want to be really clear, like, it can be hourly, it can be monthly, it can be, you know, quarterly, it can be annually. It, you know, could be 4 years. I think that we would argue that shorter is better.
Yeah, and I just want to make sure I'm crystal clear that again, compliance is still on a 4-year basis. Where regardless, you know, even if the legislature had said compliance is on a 10-year basis, this is still trying to determine which megawatt hours are able to be used for compliance, not trying to say over which time period compliance happens. Does that make sense? I want to make sure I was clear on that.
Yeah, I just was curious how that worked. Thanks.
Yeah. And basically the reason we think more granular is better is because, you know, there is considerable seasonal variation, for example. And so if we really do want to see a system that is 100% clean, getting it down to a monthly basis, for example, would help ensure that we actually have clean resources to serve customers in those months as well.
So a question that I've got also for the for NWAC and Climate Solutions. It's based on example 4. In that example, the utility is generating or procuring renewable energy in an amount equal to 100% of its load. And it also appears to be engaging in secondary market transactions, buying and selling unspecified power. What's the logic or the law on kind of attributing the renewable energy that the utility procured to its secondary market sales instead of to its retail load?
But I don't know if I fully understand your question. So what's the law around?
Are the policy where in that example, the load was 200 megawatts. They generated renewable or non-emitting generation in an amount equal to 100% of their load. And they engaged in secondary market transactions that balanced, they bought 50, they sold 50. And yet in your proposal, you would attribute some of the renewable energy to the secondary market sales. And I'm not following why you would do that, either in terms of it's required by law in some way, or that it reflects good policy. What's the good policy that would be behind that attribution?
Yeah, so I mean, I think I'll step back and let me know if this is not answering your question, but kind of on the reasoning. If we imagine the unspecified purchases, I know that's not necessarily what unspecified is, but let's imagine unspecified was gas, right? Let's say that at the time a utility was purchasing it, it was 80% gas because the market was, we were short on energy, and so gas was generating. So if they're purchasing gas, and then let's say 2 months later, there's excess hydro, surplus hydro, and they're selling hydro, basically what if we allow that situation to happen is we are still allowing a utility to rely on fossil fuels and supply fossil fuels to their customers, but consider that being clean energy that's sold to their customers. And so what this would do is say, we're going to look over a time period what you're actually, generating at the time, or what your residual system mix is, and actually attribute a sale to that. So that if you're selling, surplus energy in March, let's say, we're actually going to attribute and assume that you are selling hydro at that time. You're not selling just unspecified emitting energy. Does that help to answer your question?
Well, I mean, you've inserted an assumption about time period, and yet you presented this as something that would work over multiple designs, with different time periods. So I'm still left with it appears that you would allow the utilities to make specified sales in the market with the renewable attribute, retained for those sales. And yet you would limit the ability of the utility to make specified sales to its own customers, because you would remove the renewables from the retail, the part attributed to retail, and instead assign that through the residual mix to the wholesale sales. And I'm not understanding the policy behind that proposal.
Well, I might just throw in here that, the reason that the imputation is part of the proposal is simply because of the need to characterize what wasn't used. And so if that were in fact a unspecified sale, right? Technically happening as an unspecified sale in the market, but the utility was able to document that, okay, no, it actually came from this generator over here, and so therefore we know that it was gas. Then I think the good policy approach would be to say that was gas instead of using the imputation, right, to apply some renewable character to it that it doesn't have. So does that help?
Well, no, it's because in the example that you posed, they made a purchase that was unspecified. And if you want to have an example where they purchased natural gas and sold it as unspecified, then we could talk about whether that was a good practice or not. But in the example, it comes in as unspecified, it leaves as unspecified. But somehow in the process of doing that, the utility lost 40 megawatt hours of renewables that it had acquired and used to serve retail load. And I'm not understanding why.
I think there are two different time periods that they're purchasing the unspecified and they're selling the unspecified. So again, in my example, let's imagine they're purchasing unspecified in July and they're selling unspecified in March. And those have two very different characteristics, likely. I mean, it would depend on each utility, but they have very different characteristics associated with them. And so again, it's trying to account for, unspecified purchases and sales are not all the same. And so shouldn't just net each other out, that we should actually be documenting what those sales are in a given time period.
Are there other questions, or Steve or Austin or commissioners?
This is Steve Johnson. I'd actually move to a question I had about documentations for the utility proposal, if I may, and Ian or Mary can take this, or anyone else on the call for that matter. So there's a reference to delivery points, and I was curious, if we were writing a rule and enforcing a rule, where the documents would come, or what document would be audited or relied on by the utility to establish the point of delivery of the energy being claimed for the 80% bucket?
This is Ian Hunter.
Sure, I can.
Oh, Mary, you want to take it?
Go ahead, Ian. No, go ahead, Ian.
Typically, when a utility either purchases or acquires a resource, there is a specified point of delivery in the power purchase agreement. And so we would likely be using the power purchase agreement or whatever contractual arrangement that utility has, either with the power purchase agreement with the third party, or if they own the resource, what kind of that document would be the documentation that you'd be using.
And then, so you're using that document, and let's say you have a call contract. You'd call some of the contract, but maybe not all of the contract, depending on whether it was in the money. I mean, sometimes these are used just to hedge positions and fill out resources in case. So you've called on some of it, not on others. So where would you get the documentation for how much energy you used in that contract with that delivery point?
So let me maybe try and put some numbers to the example. In the scenario you're describing, you would have a utility that, say, has a call option for 50 megawatts of specified energy. So let's say wind, to be delivered to mid-sea, and the utility would then pick it up from there.
Yep.
The utility would have to exercise that agreement, and then the generator would have to actually generate in order for that utility to claim compliance credit for it. So let's say the utility says, we only need 30 megawatt hours. We're exercising it on, hour ending 8 tomorrow. So those 30 megawatts generate, the utility gets the environmental attributes, presumably as part of the specified sale transaction. So they have the 30 megawatts, the energy was delivered to mid-sea, and that would be the documentation that they would use at the end of the compliance period to say, we used that energy, which we acquired together with the environmental attribute.
So those would be, those documents you're referring to would be the sales and billing component documents that the utility would generate and send to the other generator. I mean, the seller.
So if we're looking at the individual components of what the utility would require, the utility would have the contract, which specifies that the energy was acquired together with the environmental attribute. That's kind of condition one. Condition two, the contract would specify an eligible point of delivery. The unit would actually have to generate. So we would have the recs to show that the utility or the generator actually generated. And we would have to prove that it didn't double count. So we'd have to show that we didn't sell energy on a specified basis out back into the market.
So what document would you be relying on that third component to determine that the generator generated?
That's a good question.
You don't need to answer it right now, but that's my thinking. Like, I'm actualizing these, so I just want to put that on the table. I don't want to put anybody on the spot. I'm just thinking and grinding away in my head. Like, okay, we write a rule, we implement the rule, we enforce the rule, and I'm so I don't want to put you on the spot. I mean, I just thinking.
Steve, can I just add too? I think there's really a component. Like these same types of questions, I think are also would apply to like existing RPS policies, including 937, where you go through a process to confirm the eligibility of the resource based on point of delivery and contracts and things like that Ian is already talking about. And then essentially the generation is verified with Regis as far as the recs are created, and you have documentation based on that verification process that the generator generated what you said it did. And then you will also have the transactional documentation that Ian had regarding kind of, if some portion of the generator was purchased versus a different portion. But I think there's existing mechanisms in place to accomplish what I think you're asking.
Yeah, so I agree there's some of the components, but what we're doing here different than in your proposal, the utility proposal is different than RPS, is we're matching this production with this delivery point, and that's not required under EIA right now. So, and we, I mean, under the proposal, I'm thinking, and tell me if I'm wrong, that you actually, at some point we have to, in order to force, I mean, poor staff at the UTC has to do this, has to match that generation with this delivery point and know both the generation happened and the delivery point was specified, and put them together. And that's, but just take that away. I mean, we're not going to solve it here today, and we don't have to, but I'm just putting out some of the thoughts I have about how to implement these in a way that is enforceable. That's all.
And I guess I will just, one of the things I was thinking about in listening to both presentations is what Steve just mentioned. As a regulator, we're going to have to audit, and we're going to have to verify that what a utility brings forward would meet the requirement. And with the level of detail that would be required, this could be quite a daunting task. And I don't know that you could feasibly have a staff person go through every single ETAG to verify that for every single transaction, or even what the utilities have suggested. So we're going to have to feasibly audit these, right? So that's going to have to be part of the rules, whatever tracking mechanism and documentation basis we come up with. It is just not feasible to have the staff at Commerce or the staff at UTC go through every single ETAG or every single document. So that's something we need to consider regardless of which methodology we go forward. I just wonder if there's any thoughts about that.
and a follow-up to that, and thank you, is what level of scrutiny do we have to give it? Can we do spot audits? Is it just the fact that we're hovering and can audit anybody at any time? What level of review or hovering do we have to do?
And I can just say I really appreciate that from both of you. Obviously, staff capacity is, we want to make this the least staff intensive as possible. But I think where we're still struggling with is the answer to this policy question of, what is the intent and what's the interpretation of CETA? Can a utility in fact sell energy and still consider that, a bundled resource? And I think that it's hard when we don't have an interpretation on what that policy, what that interpretation is, to then, actually work together and figure out, well, what could a very streamlined documentation process look like once we have the answer to kind of that fundamental question. What is the intent? What is the outcome we're looking for? And then how can we streamline it?
And I'm going to add to that, commissioners, to your question. I think, this is certainly an area where we would defer to the agency's discretion, just like when UTC analysts perform a financial audit on the companies, they're essentially sampling things. And so, I would kind of say, we don't have an answer to that. We think there's probably some best practices that can be referred to and, auditing guidelines. And we would probably just want to defer to the agency's discretion and expertise on that.
Can I make a comment here as well? I just want to say that a couple of things quickly. I do think we have a similar concern around kind of the transaction basis proposal. I think I mentioned this. E-tags, the presentation indicated that e-tags are in existence to represent all energy transactions. That's not currently true. We don't tag every transaction. So even if we did go to a system where we had to tag every single transaction, I think you would actually balloon the quantity of e-tags to a even more unmanageable level than exists today. But I do think that our proposal, I think, is relatively straightforward in terms of measuring compliance. I really do think that there are existing tools in place to really measure energy production, and we know that we do that already. I think what the utilities are really trying to do is focus on, what do we know? We don't know source distinct transactions with a lot of confidence, or source distinct accounting with a lot of confidence. I'm not talking about tracking electrons. I'm just trying to do this kind of on a 5-minute or hourly basis is really challenging. What we do know is what energy was produced, and we know what energy was consumed. And that's what we're comparing. And I think it's relatively straightforward to be able to verify the energy that was produced or purchased. I think there's existing tools in place to do that. And I think it's relatively straightforward to compare those values to retail load.
So if I got it right, then we're faced with sifting through e-tags or sifting through every sales contract to see what was actually eventually generated, where it was delivered. So I got a headache. I got 2 headaches. But I think that's, and then we could sample, but we need, if we're sampling things, we'd have to still sample one of those 2, call them databases vaguely, or sets of paper contracts or electronic contracts. So let's walk away back from this and let me over to another subject.
Just one more comment, Steve. Oh, sorry. I just want to make one more quick comment. At least speaking for PacifiCorp, and I don't know all utilities are like this, but the vast majority of our compliance is from long-term resources. And so you're not sifting through, tons of transactions necessarily. Really the bulk of the compliance is coming from these long-term owned resources. So anyway, which is easy comparably.
I'll offer up another question. I talked some with Kelly and Lauren about the time frame that would be, applied, and the utilities had a more specific proposal of applying it on an annual basis, and I wondered how you arrived at that as opposed to. I got the point that it was a compromise compared to the 4-year period, but did you discuss other time periods, in particular, like a monthly application of this method instead of an annual?
Yeah, so as we were developing it, we kind of looked at different time periods and said, how does this line up with utility operations? How does this line up with other state requirements, other policies that the state has in place? And annual seemed to be the best sweet spot to make that eligibility test. And I do want to be really clear that the utility proposal still has a 4-year compliance period, but you're testing the eligibility on a yearly basis. So it's still that 4-year compliance period that we're talking about. But utilities did look at different timeframes, and annual was the best fit.
And I'll just add one more thing to that. I think it really is also about, like what we talked about, drawing a balance between, trying to give the utilities flexibility over kind of monthly and seasonal variations, and the need to manage that over time, while making this transformation.
And just to respond to that, I mean, we believe that there's inherent flexibility in the law, that is why the 2030 standard provided 20% to be met with alternative compliance mechanisms, and that seasonal variation, that monthly variation in clean energy generation versus what you're actually using to serve your load is something that we think this law was intended to transform the sector into creating demand for other resources that will help smooth out that variation and ensure that you are serving eventually your customers with clean energy all the time.
If I could, I'd move on to a slightly different topic, and it's mainly to clarify something for me that I'm not sure I understand. I mean, I heard in this presentation, the utility presentation, statements like delivered to that point for delivery into Washington. But when I think back on the proposal in the previous dockets that you've made, we talked about a bunch of delivery points. So let me pick an example here to make it clear. There's a utility that only has load service in Washington, and they're picking up the energy the purchase at COI. Is the idea, of course, COI is in a market. So
Steve, can you explain what COI is?
Sorry, California Oregon Intertie, which it's a magical place where the state borders of California and Oregon cross some transmission lines. There's not, in fact, a real substation there. So it's kind of a trading point. But anyway, so is the idea that that has to be deliverable? Is there another component that says that has to be deliverable to that Washington utility, or is that just showing that delivery point for the megawatts energy? Are we done? I just want to make sure I understand.
Yeah, so the idea behind, and let me take an extreme example to say one of the concerns that we were trying to address. We wanted to make sure that there wasn't room in the statute or the rules for a utility to invest in a wind project in Maine, and then which has no feasible way of delivering actual energy to their customers, and then harvesting the RECs and selling the energy off into the marketplace. We wanted to make sure that there was at least some measure of reasonableness that the utility could reasonably serve their customers with load. And so once you say we're going to be putting these requirements in there, you have to balance, because you're writing these rules, you want to make sure that you're not excluding something that a utility could otherwise use. So we wanted to try and be both broad, but also keep that, you know, reasonability in there. So for example, the COI, which is a market point of delivery in your example, if the utility is participating in a market, then that could be an eligible place where it would be a reasonably deliverable. If a utility wasn't participating in a market, it may not fall into that. And I think we specify that in our rules, that to use a market point of delivery, you've got to actually be a participant in that market. Similarly, you know, the Bonneville BA, that's a pretty wide footprint, but it also kind of meets the needs of Bonneville customers who are going to have transmission across Bonneville's system. So trying to strike that balance between, you know, being specific enough that there's some reasonability, but not so specific that we exclude, you know, reasonable transactions from eligibility.
So if I'm envisioning taking your proposal into written rules, I'd say, here's a bunch of delivery points. And I would say something like, and you're a market participant in, you know, and it's covered by these delivery points, the market. And so therefore if you have your energy delivered there, we don't need any more documentation than it moved from there to your load, to your balancing area. Is that correct?
Yeah, so yes, what would be required is the utility would have to show in their contract that the energy that they purchase has a point of delivery that falls within that sphere of identified eligible points of delivery. Now, presumably, any utility that has a contract like that in place is going to have transmission assets to bring it the rest of the way. Because if they don't and they can't sell in the marketplace, they're stuck.
Yep. Yeah. But then let me clarify one other thing about this annual surplus theory. If a utility had 100 megawatts of load, again, these are very simple examples for all the high load hours, those are 16 hours, Monday through Saturday. And they had 100 megawatts of load, they had 120 megawatts of renewables. They could sell off the 20 and, I guess as unspecified, retain the RECs, and so long as there was still room in their year of total load, they could use those RECs for 80% compliance. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, that's helping me just understand what the boundaries are, so when I go to words in a rule, I don't say them wrong. Thanks.
Yeah.
Can I just add a comment to there? I want to kind of underscore too what I was mentioning before about most of this being fairly straightforward. You know, utilities and have an incentive to build resources to serve load on its system, which is deliverable to its load. So I think, you know, this example of buying a resource in Maine is a pretty far-flung. I mean, you know, notwithstanding the fact that Maine's far away, I think utilities want to have resources on their system that they can use to serve load, and so I think we will find that the vast majority of the resources that are being used for compliance are on the system and it's very easy to verify that they're on the system and that they're deliverable to Washington load.
Yeah, so I think you're right, Mary, that there is an incentive to cover your load with your resources and get them to your load so that you're not exposed to the market, for sure. I think the question is there another obligation under CETA to use renewables to do that for 80% of your load, and what does that used mean? So I'm just kind of, thanks for answering some of the questions.
There was a question in the chat for NWAC and Climate Solutions about how your proposal would work within an organized market. Would one of you like to respond to that now? And then I think after that, it's probably time for us to take a break, and then we'll go to kind of open comments.
So I might want to phone a friend on that one. Fred or Johnny, or either of you available to answer that question?
So Glenn, are you talking about a regional market that really doesn't exist yet? Or are you talking about the existing mid-C or the EIM market?
Claire, do you want to clarify your question? It was,
Is that-
how
is
does the
that clear?
Climate Solutions NWEC proposal work within organized markets?
We can't hear you, Claire.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm at a campground in Michigan. My dog needed a walk. I meant organized in EIM or an RTO, both. They work the same way. So if we can figure out how it works in EIM, we can figure out how it works in RTO.
Claire, I think the issue that we're talking about is looking forward. There's going to be some kind of regional market developed, and the regional market needs to take into account the law that Washington passed. So instead of forcing our customers in Washington to comply with older backward-looking market models that were developed in California, we're saying as we go forward and develop this regional market, it needs to account for what we want in Washington and what other states in the West will want for their states, quite frankly. So since that market that you're talking about doesn't really exist, I think what the guidance would be needed is to go forward to make sure that there's some kind of documentation to comply with Washington's law for now until the compliance is needed in 2030 and the market has developed, because there's still conversations going on what an EDAM looks like. And the EIM is such a small portion of our sales right now. I think we could figure out some way to handle that.
So just to be clear, you don't have a proposal for how it would work in an organized market?
Well, we don't know what the organized market would look like.
And Fred, are you on?
Yeah, this is Fred Hewitt, Northwest Energy Coalition, also in Michigan at the moment. I think the way I would look at it is the whole question of a full market context is very different than what we're talking about here. I think we should start to think about it. But one thing we know, all the data you need to do this kind of accounting will be in that market. It doesn't have to be assembled separately. All the data will be there because all the sources and all the sinks are known. Now, how to attribute a particular source to a particular sink, another question. But I think that the other fundamental issue here is incorporating state policy into market design. We're at the point now where we can really think about that a lot more clearly. And we're also going to have to think about how to accommodate different state policies, and not only from different states, but sometimes, for example, in Washington now has an RPS, a clean energy standard, and a cap and trade program. They're separate but related. How are we going to account for what's happening in the power sector from within a full market context? That's a good discussion to have, but I don't think it's ripe yet. What we're really talking about here is the current situation we've got, which is basically a bilateral market situation.
I think Claire, you can go ahead and speak. Sorry, it sounds like you're trying to talk.
I'm so sorry. I am walking around a campsite. My apologies.
We can hear you.
I think maybe that was inadvertent.
Okay.
Shall we break now, Austin?
Let us take a break and be back at 2:55. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Austin, there was a question in the chat box about how to get called on, how to raise your hand and so forth. So if you want to explain that.
Yeah, we got about 1 more minute here
Okay.
for 2:55. But my thoughts on that are, in the past, I've tried to balance comments that are coming in by the chat and also folks who have raised their hand as we go along. I feel like that's still kind of the approach I want to offer to folks during this webinar. I would include, seems to me that it's good to have a little bit of a conversation back and forth, and the comments section doesn't always allow for that conversation to occur. Whereas if you raise your hand, you'll be providing your feedback with your microphone. So I would encourage folks to raise their hand. We'll try to get to the questions in the chat as well. For this section, we are running a little bit behind schedule. So I wanted to emphasize from our agenda that this section that we're going to move into now is not only about clarifying questions about the proposals, it is also providing an opportunity for folks to express concerns, as well as alternative proposals that they might have for solving some of the sticky wickets that we've talked about so far today. For folks, we have, I see Mariel in the comment has raised her hand. Do you want to start? And I see NWEC as well. So Mariel, go first.
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you, the Department and Commission, for hosting this workshop. I've been able to follow a lot of it. My name is Mariel Thurasingham, and I'm Clean Energy Policy Lead with Front and Centered. We've actively participated in some CETA dockets and discussions. And I wanted to speak up on this question, which we haven't been as active in, because there's one clear understanding that we have of the purpose and intent of the Clean Energy Transformation Act, and that's of an equitable transition to 100% clean in Washington. Clean energy for all Washingtonians by 2045. The actual electricity provided by utilities that Washington customers use must be clean, renewable, emissions-free power, and any other interpretation feels off the mark. Front and Center hasn't been active in all of these kind of great conversations that have been happening on this question over the last few months in particular, but we appreciate that they happened. And that all of this great thinking is really vital to setting the regulators up for definitive rulemaking on kind of this interpretation of use and clean power for Washingtonians. People care about clean energy, not just in the grand scheme of the world, but in their daily lives. When I have conversations about clean energy and CETA, and I have these all the time with coalition members and other frontline groups in Washington, no one questions whether clean energy is an option. It's accepted as a right, but one that we have to keep fighting for, like most rights. There are ongoing discussions about what renewable energy is, what constitutes it, how energy democracy can be accomplished through local control of clean energy assets, even what clean energy is, but not whether people deserve to access it. People deserve to access it in Washington, and people want to. Many of you have seen Puget Sound Stage's report, Powering the Transition: Community Priorities for a Renewable and Equitable Future. Survey participants in their research, all from communities of color, nearly all low-income Washington residents, resoundingly favor a shift to renewable energy for their homes and community businesses, and the community businesses they rely on, and are willing to pay a premium to achieve that shift. Keeping it cheap is not good enough, and not for our communities. We have concerns with some of what we're hearing in the proposal from the utilities. Feels that the approach puts markets before people. It's an accounting scheme that privileges this convoluted definition of clean, allowing for mixed emitting resources to serve Washington. Applying renewable energy credits to emitting resources should not count towards CETA compliance. What's transformative about that? We recognize that there are allowances in CETA for alternative compliance and transformation projects, that offsets are a useful mechanism, and that there's value in building out regional markets to provide a diversity of resources over a broader footprint, but not at the expense of delivering clean, renewable, non-emitting source power to Washington customers for their use. The customers, the public that the utility are that the utilities are accountable to in their existence. CETA compliance does not live in the market realm. It's about getting clean electricity to people for turning on their lights and keeping our food cold and charging our devices and using appliances and hot water and cool air and turning on fans and air filters on hot, smoky days. That's what Washingtonians expect from CETA. And all resource and implementation planning needs to prioritize local opportunities and burdens reduction and accelerating the transition to a truly equitable clean power. We need it, we expect it, we deserve it. And without really being able to get into a lot of the technicalities of this discussion, it really sounds like the proposal on the side of kind of NWIC and climate solutions gets closer to kind of that vision of what it is, seems like a clear understanding of CETA's purpose. I just wanted to share that today. Thanks.
Thank you for your comment, Marielle. NWEC has their hand up next.
Yeah, thank you. I should have my name on that, Austin. This is Johnny Bosch with Northwest Energy Coalition. And I wanted to underline that Kelly and Lauren made it really clear that the biggest difference I think we're talking about is whether this is a production or a consumption-based system. And Mary actually seemed to really underline that with her comments about verification through Regis. So I want a clarification on the utility proposal. Would it allow retained RECs or RECs that are separated from clean power that's sold or otherwise disposed of to be applied to fossil fueled power generation and count for the 80% compliance standard?
I'll reply to that and say that we are not applying RECs to any particular megawatt hour of generation. We're applying RECs to our compliance obligation. So our compliance obligation would be whatever our total retail load summation over the 4-year compliance period is. And then we would have clean energy generation up to that total retail requirement. So we're not swapping one for another. We're talking about actual generation.
So it's not acting in this case like a RPS program on steroids that you might have generated that much, but you could use, say, gas power. If you're selling excess hydro in the spring and then using gas power in the fall, you would be applying the REC to that gas power to say it complies?
Again, we're not applying any particular REC to any particular megawatt. We're taking the position that it goes beyond an RPS in the sense that we're acquiring energy and renewable attributes together. And so looking at that over the 4-year compliance period is really how we're approaching the compliance question.
But you're acquiring it together, but you're not keeping it together, correct?
I'd like to step in here and clarify what the discussion is, what we're doing in this part of the agenda. And that is we're trying to get comments and questions from people who are participating in the workshop. And the purpose right now is not to clarify the two proposals. I think we can find opportunity for that outside the workshop. But for now, at least, we'd like to hear from a variety of different people. And they may have questions that, like, I didn't understand this or that. But rather than try to dig in on those questions, let's try to focus on either comments or unresolved issues that different people have seen. Thank you.
Thanks, Glenn. I believe Jim Adcock in the chat raised his hand. Jim, do you have a question that falls in line with
our
comments?
Comments are good too.
Yes.
James Adcock speaking. I want to express concerns about the utility proposal that they presented. What I hear is utilities are continuing to say, contrary to law, they do not want to actually serve 80% of load by clean energy by 2030 and 100% by 2045. For example, there was no discussion of the 80% limit in their presentation. That's because they're substituting a proposal that uses 100% RECs. Second concern is, say some unnamed utility that doesn't actually meet their 2030 requirements. Utilities are now saying they can't check you cannot check their performance in 2034. And even then, they will claim that they get to use the 22% get out of jail free card for having failed to meet the 2030 requirements in the first place. Number 3, utilities quoted as so-called instantaneous nexus between energy production and load. That no longer exists because there is storage. They can store energy in battery, they can store energy in pumped hydro, they can do it through hydro generation modulation, which is also known as wind integration and solar integration, which results in more stored energy behind the reservoirs, all of which can meet their requirements under CETA. Number 4, I continue to be very concerned about double counting of RECs. It is double counting to accept rates from states issuing fake RECs, i.e. states that allow utilities to issue RECs associated with state mandates, regardless of the contract language. Regardless of the contract language within the state, utilities and other players can always engage in a shell game. Okay. Both Washington state rules and EPA rules define RECs from these states as being fake RECs. Accepting fake RECs means Washington state ratepayers are paying for other states' mandates. Finally, number 5, you talked about sample auditing. My simple suggestion is to allow stakeholder organizations working under non-disclosure to also audit RECs for fraud and energy and generation in general for fraud. In any case, you're going to have a method in place to audit RECs, which equals 20% or more of the energy, to make sure the RECs are not fraudulent. So you're going to have to go there anyway. Thank you, Vib.
Thank you, Jim. Tyler Pepple is the person I saw next. Tyler, would you like to unmute and pose your question or make a comment? If not, let's go to Lisa Gafkin. Lisa, we cannot hear you, or I can't hear you.
Nor can I.
I was double muted. I apologize. I'm calling in and doing the video thing and had both things muted. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Perfect. So good afternoon. My name is Lisa Gafkin. I'm an Assistant Attorney General and I represent Public Counsel. I am also joined today by a couple of other folks. Stephanie Chase is a regulatory analyst with Public Counsel, and Dr. Ezra Hausman is with Ezra Hausman Consulting and is working with us as well. I want to take a moment to offer a few observations. We also, as has been expressed all afternoon, we have appreciated the discussions that we've had with stakeholders. I think it's fair to say that there is a philosophical difference between the utilities and the environmental advocates, but we are engaged in healthy ongoing discussions, and I think that's a good thing. I don't think that this next point can be stated too much. From our perspective, it is really important to keep top of mind that CETA sets out 2 standards. One being the 100% clean standard that begins in 2045. And under that standard, utilities are not able to use greenhouse gas producing sources to serve Washington customers. The other standard is the 2030 standard, the greenhouse gas neutral standard. Under the 2030 standard, that requires 0 net emissions associated with the provision of electrical service to Washington customers as measured over a 4-year implementation period. From Public Counsel's perspective, the challenge with the use discussion really centers around that 2030 standard. What does it mean to deliver power to customers, and how are excess renewable or non-emitting powered and unspecified purchases handled? And what do we do with line loss and storage loss? Those are all still open questions or issues that are still being grappled with among the stakeholders. From Public Counsel's perspective, it's really important to implement CETA in a way that provides sufficient guidance. The utilities need to understand what is being required of them, and customers must receive the benefit for what they pay for in rates. Public Council would like to see CETA implemented in a way that is efficient and cost-effective. We want to avoid policies that will encourage or require the utilities to overbuild or overprocure in order to meet the CETA mandates. We also want the policies to effectively achieve CETA's clean energy goals and directives. I wanted to address next steps just very briefly. I noted in the agenda that there's a call for what the next steps might be. I think the conversation today has been very helpful in clarifying the proposals and moving the issue of use forward. I think having the opportunity to submit written comments to the agencies would be useful, followed perhaps by another workshop. I want to talk a little bit about Dr. Hausman. He's an expert in energy and environmental economics and has over 2 decades of experience with energy markets. I am absolutely thrilled to be working with him on this important rulemaking and appreciate his expertise. I want to turn to him now to see if he has any additional comments or questions that he would add to mine.
Thanks, Lisa. Thank you for your kind words. Yeah, I think this has been a really very productive discussion. I did have one question. Actually, it's a kind of a specific question that I put in the chat for the environmental advocates position. I think one of the concerns that I've heard expressed by many stakeholders, including by public counsel, is that there's an inconsistency if the utilities were to purchase unspecified energy, not get credit for whatever renewable content it may have, but then have to impute renewable content to unspecified energy that is sold to third parties. So that's a concern that I'd be curious what the environmental advocates' response is to that. And following on that, if they did, in an example that's been discussed at length today, produce extra hydropower at one time during the year and use gas power at another time, if they sold that excess hydropower not as unspecified, but as gas power, if that would solve the problem and then would avoid having to impute any renewable energy content to that. So I appreciate your thoughts on those questions.
Do you want to, are we able to respond then? And is that the format we're working with? Austin or Glenn?
I think it would be better for us to work our way through, identify these questions, and then figure out next steps during that part of the agenda. So.
Thank you, Ezra, for your question. So, Tyler Pebble, we had audio connections earlier, and I just wanted to make sure we didn't miss you. Do you have audio now? You are showing up on my screen as muted.
Can you hear me now?
We can.
All right. Sorry, you think I would have figured this out by now. This is Tyler Pepple for the Alliance of Western Energy Consumers. I just wanted to state that AWEC isn't quite aligned at this point with either the Climate Solutions NWEC proposal or the utility proposal. And just to start with the Climate Solutions NWEC proposal, I think I saw on their slides that they pointed out that electricity that is sold can't be used to meet retail load. And that seems to be kind of sort of what a lot of their proposal turns on. And we don't really agree with that statement in the sense that CETA doesn't really require that electricity be used to serve load. It requires that electricity be used to demonstrate compliance with the 2030 and 2045 standards. And the standard applies to quote unquote retail sales of electricity, which we interpret to be a financial standard, not a load service standard. So it's not really, in our mind, relevant to say that if electricity has been sold, it can't be used to serve load. That electricity has been paid for by customers through retail rates, and thus it's being used to meet the applicable standard. So that's how we would interpret how CETA compliance is intended to be achieved. It's really through, you know, what are customers paying for in rates. And, you know, with regard to the utility proposal, you know, we understand, you know, their attempt to compromise, and certainly, you know, appreciate that, and, you know, would certainly like to get to a place where all stakeholders can get comfortable. But, you know, our reading of the statute really is that this is a 4-year compliance mechanism, and that the utilities have those 4 years to meet that requirement. I'd point out that I think our proposal is probably the simplest for the UTC and Commerce to audit and oversee as well, in response to Commissioner Rendell's and Chair Danner's comments. One other concern I think we have with the Climate Solutions and NWEC proposal is they would sort of impute line losses, but customers already pay for line losses. Those are factored into utility customers' rates, so that proposal would effectively require them to pay for it twice. And I think the only other comment that I want to make is that I think it would be useful, perhaps as part of the next process, for the Commission Commerce to get some estimates of what the cost is of the proposals that are on the table here. I think just sort of getting some order of magnitude would be pretty useful for the analysis. So thank you for your time. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Tyler. In the chat, I saw that in Callahan 215 had a question for the utility presenters. Would you like to unmute and state that question for the record?
Yeah, thanks, Austin. Can you hear me?
Yes.
This is Nash Callahan. I'm Assistant Attorney General for Commission staff. I had a question similar to what NWEC was asking the utility presenters earlier, which is, I would phrase it a little differently. In the PowerPoint presentation, the utilities presenters used a term, eligible generation, and I just wanted to ask a clarifying question about that, which is, you're referring there to eligible generation that is eligible towards the 80% compliance obligation. Is that correct? Okay. And so
I'm responding out of turn to just say yes.
Okay. And so my follow-up question to that is, if renewable electricity was generated, sold as unspecified, but the utility kept the REC related to that electricity, does that count as eligible generation under your proposal?
It would not only have to keep the REC, it would have to keep all environmental attributes. And so long as on an annual basis, they did not exceed their total retail load, the answer would be yes.
Okay, but so the answer would be yes. And in this proposal, exceeding the annual retail load would be the point at which anything above the annual retail load for that year would not count toward the 80% obligation. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, so anything below that annual 80% level would be able to be counted towards the 4-year compliance window for the 80% obligation.
Sorry, it would be under 100% of their annual total retail load, not 80%.
Right, okay, thank you.
Thank you, Nash, for your question. Next, we had Claire. Claire, would you like to unmute?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yeah, yes, we
and
can.
My apologies with the audio problem later. I forgot to turn my phone off. So I wanted to come back on the issue of the organized markets, because I do very much think that we need to design these rules around organized markets. You know, I take the point that EIM is actually a fairly small percentage of load at the moment, but EIM is expanding year on year. We're getting new utilities participating, we're getting new generation. I would also note that Avangrid, which is one of the world's biggest renewable developers, is also looking at EIM to bring their own resources in. And I would expect that renewable resources may be getting dispatched by the EIM more than we expect because of the challenges they have in forecasting long-term, even hour-ahead schedules. So we may see more of that generation coming through the EIM. So I don't think we should dismiss this as a problem we don't need to solve now. I think we must solve it for the EIM and any other market design that may evolve. I also agree that, and I think all of us do, that we are going to see some evolution in how organized markets are designed. But I am deeply skeptical that organized markets are going to evolve in the way that the environmental, that NWEC and Climate Solutions seem to think. I've heard hourly RECs thrown around. Yes, hourly RECs are completely feasible. What those would do is they would simplify the administrative accounting and tracking. They wouldn't be using new information because you can already get that information from meter data effectively. So that's not new. There is a lot of interest and ongoing discussions in the Eastern RTOs looking at changing market design to better value and integrate renewable resources. I would cite the ongoing discussions regarding the minimum offer price in PGM as one of those. But what those are doing is looking for ways that the markets can better integrate and optimize renewable resources to get value both for customers and for those resources. What they are not doing is attempting to track individual generation to individual load. And the reason they are not doing that is as soon as you do that, you've effectively collapsed to a bilateral market and you lose all the efficiencies of a centralized dispatch over a centralized market footprint. So I am deeply skeptical that the markets will evolve in the way that NWEC and Climate Solutions seems to think they will. So I don't think so just to close, I'll just reiterate my opening point. I don't think we put this conversation off. I think we need to have a solution now that will work with the organized markets. And I think we actually, quite honestly, need to have a solution that is consistent with both organized markets and bilateral sales. So we don't have one set of rules for bilateral transactions and a completely different set of rules for organized market transactions. Obviously, there are some things that are going to be different because of, for instance, the tracking mechanisms with e-tags and how you can document this stuff. But we should be looking for some consistency across market transactions. Thank you.
Thanks, Claire, for your comment. In the chat, next I had Rachel Brownbaugh, if I'm pronouncing your last name right. My apologies if I'm not.
That's okay. It's Brumbaugh. Thank you. That's okay. It's not an easy one. So yes, my name is Rachel Brumbaugh. I'm the Director of Climate and Energy Initiative for King County. I want to thank you for the opportunity to engage in this workshop today. So like Mariel, I am less deep into this issue than probably most other participants on this call, particularly the presenters, but it's a really important issue to us. In King County, we hear really clearly from residents that they care about the energy, the electricity used to serve their needs, and they want it to be clean as the law requires. Achieving the CETA goals of 100% clean energy by 2045 is essential to reaching King County's and all 39 cities' emission reduction goals of 80% by 2050. Well, we've done the math, we have charts, we've done the analysis. Without CETA compliance and 100% clean electricity supplies, we will not be able to reach these goals. When King County Executive Constantine testified in favor of CETA in the legislature a couple years ago, he did not envision that CETA would be an elaborate compliance scheme where RECs could be applied to emitting resources and called clean. And I recognize that this is allowed for in the 20% alternative compliance option for 2030. And I understand that and acknowledge that the legislature provided for this flexibility as part of the transition to 100% clean energy. But I'm not taking a strong position on either side, but I do have concerns about the utility approach of allowing for what appear to me essentially to be offsets for emitting resources does not really clean up the local problems, and it slows the transition to truly equitable clean power. You know, CETA was meant to be transformational, and I feel like in order to truly meet the requirements of the law, the utilities need to plan for and acquire and ultimately serve customers with clean energy. And this means maximizing energy efficiency and demand side resources to reduce loads, and then serving the remaining load with clean energy, you know, renewables and non-emitting. So thank you again for the opportunity to comment. I really appreciate all the work folks have put into it, and look forward to continued dialogue.
Thank you, Rachel. Kyle, we have you next with your hand raised.
Great. Hi, Kyle Frankowicz, Commission staff. I have a question, or maybe I'll call it a comment, and I hope that folks can respond. If not now, then maybe in the record later. But the rulemaking adoption order for the previous rulemakings, UE 191023 and 190698, that adoption order talks about unspecified electricity and its application, or its, what's the word? Susceptibility maybe to the $100 per megawatt hour penalty. In paragraph 87 of that order, it talks about, under this definition, unspecified electricity is not affirmatively renewable or non-emitting. And accordingly, we conclude that the $100 penalty applies to any unspecified electricity. The thing I'm getting stuck on is the implication that this order suggests that tracking of thermal assets is one of the pieces of the puzzle here. And I don't know that either of the proposals, and maybe I'm misunderstanding, but I don't understand, or I'm not tracking whether either of the proposals are suggesting that we should or need to track thermal generation used either for sales or to meet load. And I guess I'm having a hard time reconciling those two pieces. I'm understanding the utility proposal as one where we say, what we need are generation and the attributes associated with that generation to equal load. And to the extent that we use generation in ways that don't meet load necessarily, as long as those two numbers equal out, then that's what CETA requires. I'm hearing from the non-utility proposal that the biggest hole in that system is understanding whether sales from utilities could possibly be considered to meet load. And I appreciate Tyler's thought on the idea that if utilities are using ratepayer dollars to buy and sell it, then maybe that would count as useful to customers. But yeah, I guess my core concern, I guess, is the rulemaking order that we have and the implications of some of the comments in there and how they might reconcile here. And maybe we can discuss this more offline if other folks have thoughts on that. But just wanted to raise that as one of the many things I'm trying to reconcile as we think through these really complicated problems.
Thanks, Kyle. The next person that I have on my screen is Kevin. Kevin, would you like to unmute?
Yeah, thanks, Austin. Kevin Jones, Vashon Climate Action Group, member of the Washington Clean Energy Coalition. I also appreciate the opportunity for the session and for comments and UTC opportunities to comment. I also am not deeply in this specific issue regarding CETA, although I did participate in the rulemaking as well as support for the legislation. When I read the CETA law, there's lots of words that set expectation that Washington state consumers will receive electricity that is not from emitting resources. The notion that I could try to appease members of the Vashon Climate Action Group by saying we're going to set aside some of those expectations because markets that might influence the state don't allow us to have our voice in what we have decided we as people who vote in Washington State want is not, that wouldn't be a pretty conversation. I would not want to have that conversation. I really think we need to stick to the CETA regulations and make sure that the markets are able to align with what we have and what we want. Customers do care, people don't want to turn on their air conditioner when, say, some of that electricity that powers it is going to continue to contribute carbon emissions and make the problem of climate disaster worse and have to turn on that air conditioner more often. That is not what people are looking for. I hear that a lot. Use should be defined as the electricity that the customers use. And I think it's as simple as that. It doesn't need to be made more complicated, even though I respect the complications of the system. I am a retired electrical engineer, so I understand how challenging things can be. I really think it's essential that we adopt a system that inspires customer confidence that the utilities are transitioning to clean energy production and delivering clean energy to customers. The integrity of the CETA process depends on a whole lot of things like precision and accuracy and transparent accounting of the resource mixes of the utilities and therefore the resources that customers in Washington are receiving. Defining use that allows for continued dirty electricity generation is really not consistent with the people that I have talked to that have expectations around this law. The one issue that was raised earlier was, I think we need to create regulatory incentives to make sure that utilities do move away from fossil fuel generation. The idea that we should accept a possibility that a utility will address, say, short-term load needs using fossil fuels and then make up the renewable generation difference during a time of year when they have excess renewable energy capacity is not okay. So the idea that we just say, well, hey, over this time period, the utility generated 200 megawatts and their load was 200 megawatts and they had some other sales and transactions going on, that's okay. No, that's not okay. It's not okay if dirty electricity was used to get the utility to address a peak load. CETA asks that we use and benefit from clean energy. People of the state don't want to be responsible for creating more contribution to the climate catastrophe that we already have. And so I appreciate the opportunity to make comments. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kevin. The last person I would like to end this portion of the conversation here and move to next steps, but there are a few comments in the chat expressing concerns around markets, around RECs, and adjusting for line losses. And we had Teresa Hampton as the last person that I see that wanted to comment in this portion. Teresa, are you there?
I'm here. Thanks, Austin. Appreciate it. So I just I wanted to offer a few thoughts and maybe some additional information. We are part of the utility proposal, so we do support that proposal. The thing that I thought was nice to see is that we do agree, actually in both presentations, that the law should drive transformational change, right? It's just, and I believe we agree that we don't want these rules to impair utilities' ability to engage in organized markets, right? But there are differences clearly in the how. There are a couple of things I kind of wanted to remind us of, especially as we look to rules for the 2030. There are many checks and balances in the bill. We have been focused on a word or a phrase. We think there's a full phrase there that talks about using in an amount equal to, but also there are integrated resource plans, CEIPs, reporting. We actually also now have a cap and trade law that will provide a lot of information about unspecified transactions. I think we have to step back and look at this in the big picture context and not put too much complexity into something when you have other methods or measures to look at. In particular, that goal we agree on, we have to drive transformational change. The other thing that we have not talked about a lot, but the law also recognizes the need to provide flexible tools to manage the variability of hydro. We were in those conversations, many of us. That variability is not just an annual variability, it is recognized as a variability that happens across seasons, across days. And so that the ability to manage the variability of hydro is really essential. I do want to voice just a concern, a specific concern about the proposal to impute kind of content to unspecified sales. There seems to be a lot of focus on these unspecified sales for reasons that are not obviously clear. I think there are a lot of methods to really measure the level of investments in renewables and imports of unspecified, but it is not only one-sided, it's assuming unspecified that you sell has a certain content to it. It doesn't recognize that the unspecified we purchase is actually getting cleaner over time, right? It often is renewable oversupply from other states, but it's sold as unspecified because that selling entity is not selling the attribute itself. But most importantly, to impair the use of purchases and sales or to make it complicated or overly complex is really concerning, because that's how utilities balance the increasingly variable loads and resources in their system, and that it is essential to manage cost and reliability. So I just wanted to note that, but really, you know, if we're focusing on transformational change, we think we really have some options there for being able to measure that with not having to get to a high level of complexity. Thanks.
Thank you, Teresa. I'd like to now turn to the next item on our agenda, which is next steps. And first provide an opportunity for Glenn or Steve to provide any sort of context for what the agencies might be looking for here.
Well, this is Steve Johnson. As stated on the agenda, we would like to hear from stakeholders on what they feel would be a productive next course suggestions. I do want to point out that back in June, the Commission and Commerce agreed to postpone some of the workshops we had and let stakeholders discuss amongst themselves what they could resolve. And we're now here about 2 months later. But I do think you have learned a lot and brought yourselves closer together, but I'm willing to take suggestions on what you all think the agency should provide in terms of structure. I'm not going to call anybody, but if it's easier, I can. I can pose a question. For instance, do you want to keep talking to each other? Do you want to keep negotiating, discussing this? And you know.
And, you know, we did hear from public counsel a suggestion for written comments to be followed by another workshop. So that's one kind of next step comment that we've already heard. And I see a couple more in the chat in favor of that.
Feel free to raise your hand too if you want to express your concern or your suggestions verbally.
So this is Commissioner Rendell. I wonder if it would be helpful, and I'd appreciate some thoughts on this, instead of just comments on the proposals, would it be helpful to have specific questions from Commerce and the Commission about the proposals, or do we want to just make it open? For example, Tyler Peppel suggests that we ask for estimates of cost impacts from the proposals. So just curious how we want to structure those comments. I agree, some comments would be helpful.
Lauren, you have your hand raised.
Yeah, this is sort of in response to Commissioner Rendell's questions. I do think written comments seem like a logical next step, but I do think for the purposes of the conversations that we've been having, we really need to have a sense of what the agencies feel like they need. And so I would kind of suggest that having some structured questions, designed to get to the specific issues that you all feel like you need to address in the rule would be really helpful in structuring sort of where we should focus our attention, if that makes sense.
Thank you, Lauren, for that suggestion.
Can I ask a follow-up to the group? Are people comfortable trying to comment on the proposals as they've evolved based on the slide presentation in today's workshop, or would they think they need more in writing in order to make more detailed responses, or not?
Claire, do you raised your hand prior to Steve's question? But do you have a suggestion?
Yeah, and it was actually, I was thinking, kind of anticipating, I guess, Steve's question. I would certainly support another round of comments. I guess I don't really see a whole lot of value in asking more pointed questions again at this point, because we've had 2 iterations of that in my recollection, as well as some earlier not focused comments on this issue. And I also wonder, it seems to me there may be some value in a workshop in the future, but I'm not sure there's value in having another workshop until we see a proposal by the agencies. I've not been involved in the utility discussions with the environmental community, but I know they're being ongoing for months. Quite honestly, I'm not sure if those will come to fruition, and I think it would be useful to allow others, those of us who haven't been participating in that, to have a voice again. And then I think you guys need to go back and wrestle with this. I think you've heard perspectives on both sides, and when you come back with something, then I think it's probably more reasonable then to have another workshop and get reactions.
Thank you, Claire, for your comments. Kelly Hall, and then we'll have Chair Danner.
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree with Claire that I'm not sure what else I'm certainly happy to do written comments again, but I do feel like we have put it all out there, and I'm not sure what additional information we will get with written comments at this point. I think, I think this might be an unpopular comment, but I do think that we need direction on the interpretation of what the law says. Again, I said this before, but what is the outcome that we are looking for? And I think that will help advocates and utilities then really try to come together and come up with a proposal that achieves that outcome. But without fully understanding where the agencies are on kind of what the interpretation of the law and what it means to use electricity, what that means, I do find that it's very challenging for us to come up with a joint proposal at this point. So I think would love to, I think utilities and advocates will continue these discussions, outside of this process, and we'll continue to try to come together, but some direction from the agencies I think would be really helpful.
Thank you, Kelly. Chair Danner.
So I agree with Kelly that I don't see any value if we're going to do another round of comments and all we get is a repeat of or reiteration of what we've already heard. It really doesn't move the ball for us. I think it may be more helpful for us to take this back to the agencies, have an internal conversation, figure out what additional questions we would need, if any, and then we can figure out the next steps. But I think it's premature for us to say we'd like another round of comments. If we have questions for you, I think that will be the product of some internal discussions as we move forward. And I'm just speaking for myself, not for the commission or for Glenn. but that's what I think would be a better course of action at this point.
Thank you, Chair Danner. I don't see any other, there's a few comments in the chat that I'll point folks to regarding that it would be perhaps useful to have guiding questions if we are to have written comments. I'm not seeing anyone else with their hand raised at this time. And we have someone on the phone with their hand raised. That person like to unmute?
Thanks. Liz Klump with Bonneville.
Hey, Liz.
Can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Thank you. Thanks. We're not a direct regulated entity. We're a federal wholesaler across multiple states in the Northwest. But we supply 45% or more of the electricity in Washington, so we're absolutely trying to understand the regulations. I have some concerns about some of the fundamentals of how we operate and whether they're being incorporated, whether they're well understood. So for example, we have 3 different power products that we sell to public utilities in the Northwest, and 2 of those power products preclude by federal statute the utilities from reselling that power. And so the proposal to impute that a utility might be selling the federal system, I believe goes against the foundations of that federal statute. Now, there is one power product where a utility does have the ability to resell, but the majority of our customers do not buy that product in Washington. So I know that I have some concerns about are we at a shared understanding point? I mean, we're looking at CETA and interpret that it absolutely has established that RECs are the compliance tool, and we're gearing up to produce, create, retire millions of RECs. If that's not the compliance tool, maybe that could be changed in statute, but there's a lot of ideas and conversations that are being identified in this afternoon that don't necessarily coincide with our understanding of the law or our understanding of how we work. Another very practical item is the NWEC proposal acknowledged that e-tags are produced for sales across BAs. And of course, the majority of our sales to the majority of our customers in Washington, well, let me correct that. What I know is the majority of our customers in Washington are within our balancing authority, so there are no e-tags produced. So I'll stop there and just acknowledge that decarbonizing the West is an enormous lift. I hope we can navigate it. I'm not sure we're all on the same page, obviously. And at the same time, I know that many of us are trying to navigate the new Climate Commitment Act, which is a different regulation from CETA. And some of us are hoping they're complementary and they're not absolutely intermingled and overlapping. Thank you.
Thank you, Liz. I do see in the chat someone with the name NWEC, but in Mary. I don't know if that is a request from Mary to speak, but if you do want to speak, Mary, please feel free to do so.
That wasn't me. I don't know if there's a question for me or if it was, maybe it was not intended to be to everyone.
Yeah, that can happen. All right. Well, I'm not seeing any more hands raised at this time. I'm wondering if we should move to closing comments either by the rulemaking teams or the commissioners would like to make any closing comments, they're welcome to do so as well.
Well, Glenn, I always do this. I start speaking before my commissioners. So I'll just go ahead and ask if there was any additional comments the commissioners wanted to make before Glenn and I sort of wrap this up.
This is Commissioner Rendell. I'll just say that I appreciate everyone's engagement. There are a lot of people on this call, people who've been engaged in this for quite some time, and people who are new to this conversation. There's a lot of passion, a lot of interest, and a lot of complexity to this issue, and I appreciate everyone's input. I think it is time for this to come back to the agencies for us to give some guidance so we can move forward. So I appreciate all the time and the comments this afternoon.
And I just want to echo that. I think that it's been a great conversation. A lot of people have put a lot of work and a lot of thought into this. I appreciated both presentations and the give and take afterwards. This is a complex issue, and it's one we're going to continue to wrestle with, and just stay tuned. So more guidance to come. Thank you.
And Glenn, why don't you take over? Because I think my agency has spoken.
Okay. And I get the sense here that people would like both the opportunity to make written comments, but they would also like to see where the agencies might be going with this. And I think those are a little bit, not exactly the same position, but we will get together, the two agencies, and figure out what the next step should be in order to get to a decision of some sort. And I guess one thing I want to emphasize in closing is that we do recognize that this is a complicated issue and one that feels like it affects kind of fundamental objectives. And it can be easy in a discussion like this for, kind of the experts to grab all the airtime. And I appreciate the people who, don't hold themselves out to be experts, but do, speak for important values that those people did speak up today. And if anybody feels like they haven't really had that opportunity, our comment window is always open, and people can, send us written comments based on what they've heard today, or just, more generally about concerns they have with the implementation of CETA. And, so I would welcome public comments, even if they don't squarely fit with, what one expert said about some other expert during the workshop today. So thank you, everybody, for your participation and for listening to this.
And Glenn, that's a good point. And I don't want to tell a deep secret, but yes, in rulemakings, people can submit comments actually anytime they like. We usually have comment deadlines so that we have everyone organized on the same schedule. So if some of the participants from the broader public feel like they want to write comments, of course, the UTC can accept them. I will accept them at any time. So good point.
Thank you, Glenn and Steve. We had a few housekeeping items per se in the chat. One was a question about where the recording of today's meeting will be posted. The UTC will post theirs under their docket 210183 is my understanding. And for Commerce, we post ours on our CETA webpage. That's www.commerce.wa.gov CETA. And you will find it under past workshop materials. It is a PDF, and the link to the video will be in that PDF. It takes sometimes a day or two to get that all set up. So you can expect that in the coming days. If you're on our page, please sign up to our bulletin if you're not already, and future communication will go through that. I believe the UTC also has a bulletin that you can sign up to as well. Again, under their docket 210183. With that, I thank you guys for participating today, for our presenters, and hope you have a good afternoon. Bye now.
Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
Thank you.